All right, well, let's just go ahead and jump right in. So good evening, everybody. I'm not on screen, but my name's Stephanie Howard. I work in the mayor's office as his director of community safety. And I'm happy to be here with you all tonight as we get to hear a presentation from the group that you see on the screen, which is Independent Monitor LLC. As most of you likely know, as part of the city's settlement agreement with the Department of Justice, we agreed to commission an independent assessment of the city's response to the 2020 protests. And for nearly a year or so now, Independent Monitor LLC has been working on that and brought their report to council today. And I'm sure are very happy to present their report to you all this evening. Just to go over a few logistical notes, we will be taking questions in the Q&A. So please feel free to write your questions there and we'll make sure that we get to all of them. If you have any interpreter needs, I think we have only ASL interpretation was requested tonight, but do let us know if there's any other issue. We'll be sure to try to get it addressed right away. And with that, I think what I'll do is I will hand it over to Nick Mitchell to introduce himself and his team.
Well, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. As Stephanie said, we are Independent Monitor LLC. We're very pleased to be with you tonight and to present our report to you and hopefully have a rich and vibrant conversation through the Q&A about our findings, our conclusions, and our recommendations. I'm going to briefly introduce myself. I'll then hand it over to my co-panelists to briefly introduce themselves. We have probably roughly 25-ish minutes, give or take, of presentation walking through our high-level conclusions and recommendations, and then we'll just kind of go directly into Q&A to hear from you and hopefully respond to any questions that you may have. Again, it's Nick Mitchell. I am a lawyer who's worked with jurisdictions at the state, local, and federal level on issues related to the reform of policing and correctional agencies. I'm currently the court-appointed monitor of a Department of Justice consent decree with the County of Los Angeles and the Los Angeles County Sheriff Department. And I will turn it over to my co-panelists to introduce themselves.
My name is Peter Davidoff. I have roughly 30 years of experience in law enforcement, primarily in the National Capital Region. I've worked extensively with other governmental agencies and professional associations on the area of public order, and I have experience in training and operations in public order and use of force evaluation.
My name is Philip Ure. I'm an attorney. I've most recently worked as the Inspector General for the NYPD and Independent IG. Before that, started up and ran the Police Oversight Agency for the City of Washington, D.C. And before that, worked at the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, involved in bringing pattern of practice employment discrimination suits against police departments and fire departments.
Matthew Butis. I am a public policy and data analyst, currently the policy director of Denver's Office of the Independent Monitor, a civilian agency that oversees the Denver Sheriff and police departments.
Great, thank you all. So as Stephanie mentioned, we were retained by the city in May of 2022 to do an independent evaluation of the handling of the 2020 protests and riots in Portland. And that's what we did over the balance of a year. We were hired specifically to look into the effectiveness of PPB's crowd management training, the city's response to the protests of 2020, the effectiveness of the incident command system, including criteria for the declaration of unlawful assemblies or riots, for authorizing munitions of various types and communication generally. We were asked to evaluate strategies used by the city and strategies that were not used but should have been used, to evaluate communication and leadership, and to identify any other relevant factors that impacted the city's response in 2020. And so that's precisely what we did. If we go to the next slide, Matt, to do that work, in summary, we reviewed PPB's directives, SOPs, and training materials for a several-year period. We were asked to look at what was called the review period, which started at the end of May and ran through November 15th. And so we sampled 43 operational periods from that overall review period. And we analyzed operational plans, activity logs, force reports, arrest records, and after action reports from within the PPB. We examined materials associated with administrative investigations into complaints about PPB officers. We analyzed extensive video of PPB officer conduct. And probably most importantly, we interviewed dozens of officers, command staff, community members, other Portland municipal employees, elected officials, and regional partners from a variety of Portland's traditional partner agencies in the metropolitan area. Next slide. So one of the things that we attempted to do in a report that we issued a couple of weeks ago was to provide a fair and accurate recounting, to the best of our ability, an independent recounting of the key sort of turning points and events in the protests of 2020 and the city's response. I won't go through all of that here, but I would direct you to look at the report if you're interested in our perspective on what we found. I will just share several key facts that we think provide context for the analysis that we're going to share below. Again, the protests lasted from May 29th through mid-November. What we found was that there were generally large, peaceful crowds during the day and smaller crowds at night, some members of those smaller crowds were peaceful and some engaged in violence or destructive behavior. The federal government sent more than 700 federal officers to Portland, which we found escalated street conflict dramatically. The PPB relied largely upon the rapid response team, the RRT, to handle operations on the street, though it also used officers that it considers to be, or calls, mobile field forces officers. There were more than 1,000 arrests during the review period, mostly for low-level public order crimes. We found that protesters and officers experienced significant injuries during the events in question. There was more than $15 million worth of damage caused to public and private property. That may be a conservative estimate. The city's response in 2020 caused it to fall out of compliance with the DOJ consent decree, and has been widely publicly reported. In June 2021, the members of the rapid response team, or the RRT, resigned en masse after a member was criminally charged associated with the use of force against a person who was not engaged in any violence. PPB documented more than 6,000 estimated uses of force during the review period. And some of the early uses of force in June, in late May and June, led to restrictions being imposed upon PPB by Mayor Wheeler and by a United States District Judge. Other restrictions limited cooperation within Portland municipal government and with federal agencies. And we sort of walk through some of those key limitations and restrictions on the PPB in greater detail in the report. In our analysis, we start at the highest level, city leadership and PPB command. And we sort of drill down throughout the report and get sort of more detailed and granular as we go. And our first finding, which we thought was quite significant, really related to the level of engagement with the community and the extent to which the community had not been satisfactorily brought in to the development of the strategies, tactics, philosophies, and munitions that PPB was going to use for public order policing. And I'll tell you where this comes from. In our interviews with members of the community, we heard a wide range of emotions expressed. We heard quite a bit of rage about use of force by members of the PPB. We heard some community members express concern for members of the PPB and a sense of anger about a feeling that police officers had been mistreated during these events. But one of the most common expressions that we heard was a sense of surprise that people had not expected the level of sort of militarism that they saw on the street, didn't have a sense of the kinds of munitions and tools and tactics which PPB would use for crowd control or crowd management, and which we felt set the stage for the loss of public trust that occurred in 2020. We also found that there was insufficient internal oversight of RRT by PPB executives. RRT had become in many ways heralded around the country as reasonably progressive in the area of public order policing. There was certainly a lot of homegrown pride within the PPB about the RRT. RRT members were flying around the country and giving trainings to other agencies. And there was a level of deference for the RRT within the PPB command that from our perspective was not healthy or ideal. It's very important in police departments that have specialty units for there to be oversight and guidance associated with how those units do their business. And there was such a high level of deference for the RRT that when it came to RRT deployments and training, PPB executives were not rigorously scrutinizing deployments and training given the level of, I suppose, respect for the RRT. And we viewed that as problematic. We also found that PPB executives did not visit the field or debrief with officers often enough in 2020. This was something we heard frequently from police officers who we talked to, that they had a sense that they were alone on the street, didn't always feel particularly well supported by their leaders. It's very important that police officers have contact, that the leadership is out in the field, particularly for an extended deployment like the ones at issue here in 2020. To the credit of the current leadership of the Police Bureau, they also have recognized that there was an insufficient leadership presence in the field with police officers in 2020, and they've committed to fixing that. Priming is a very important concept within public order policing. And when I say priming, what I mean is it's critical that police officers are gathered together, mustered together, and that someone in a command position explains to them and walks through the relevant rules of engagement, the relevant standards for the use of particular kinds of force, emphasizes the importance of de-escalation, of maintaining a calm presence in the field, of stepping away if one is not able to be calm in the face of potential hostility in the field. So it's very important that officers be primed and that every police officer is on the same page about those core concepts. We found that PPB leaders didn't consistently prime officers with the rules of engagement before deployments, which was problematic. We also found that PPB leaders didn't consistently enforce the rules of engagement with protest crowds, or maybe better stated, there were not consistent rules of engagement with protest crowds, that the rules of engagement would fluctuate on a nightly basis. And on one night, people would be allowed to approach police facilities or other municipal buildings. And on other nights, approaching would result in the deployment of less lethal munitions like tear gas. And so when that happens, when there's an environment in which the rules of engagement are constantly fluctuating, it makes it difficult for protesters to know how to stay safe. And it also causes police officers and protesters to doubt the logic and legitimacy of the department's approach. And perhaps one of our most important findings here was that the city did not do enough to preserve its network of mutual aid partners, despite warnings that the network was in danger of failing. The city has traditionally relied upon other local law enforcement agencies to respond and provide assistance during times of emergency. There are a variety of local partners who have often helped Portland. And in the years leading up to 2020, there were signs that that network was in danger of cracking or failing entirely. And while the city did make some efforts to try to preserve that network, they were unsuccessful. And the city really had minimal amounts of support from other local law enforcement agencies throughout the review period. And we thought that was a significant problem that contributed to some of the negative outcomes that we saw during the review period. Next slide. We also, of course, examined uses of force by PPB officers. We looked at, as I mentioned, videos, extensive amounts of video. We looked at investigations into use of force. We interviewed community members. We interviewed police officers. And from the entire body of evidence that we reviewed, we were able to draw a number of conclusions about PPB's uses of force. First, PPB relied too often upon civil disturbance declarations and riot control agents like tear gas. We found that PPB would have been better able to reduce its use of riot control agents with crowd observation tools and methods that were not available in 2020. And we have some ideas and suggestions for the PPB in that regard that we discussed in the report. Slide. We evaluated PPB's use of the incident command system. So the National Incident Management System provides a unified approach for government organizations to collaborate in responding to domestic incidents. PPB actually had significant internal in-house expertise in ICS, which it used in running its command posts. And it stood up an incident management team that was structured and operated largely in accordance with ICS guidance. However, PPB did not have enough command personnel to step into key roles within that incident management team to handle a long-lasting civil disturbance like we saw in 2020. In particular, the positions of incident commander and operations section chief, which are really the two sort of critical hinges on which a police response kind of rests and turns during a large-scale civil disturbance. There were some persons who occupied those positions who had the requisite training to be incident commander, operations section chief, but they didn't have significant public order policing experience. And so that created communication problems between the command post and the field. And it also resulted in some other personnel having to serve for weeks at a time without a break in those key positions, which naturally degraded their performance over time. We also found that the incident management team was not consistently effective as a learning organization throughout the review period. It's very important in these kinds of large-scale, long-lasting deployments that involve, a significant number of protesters in the street, high risks of, municipal liability, of injury to protesters and police officers, that after the end of every operational period, there is a structured debriefing process in which the department evaluates each objective, whether or not it was successfully achieved. And if the answer is no, works to identify the root causes of that failure. And while PPB did have a process, a sort of a conversational debriefing process, it was not structured. It did not feed into operational planning for the next day and the next shift. Any lessons that were learned were undocumented, were not effectively transmitted to other members of the command staff for their use in their own operational planning. And so it needed more structure. It also did not sufficiently address compliance with the use of force policy. So one of the key aspects of an effective debriefing process is that it's an opportunity to evaluate whether the tactics being used are effective, but also whether or not the behavior being observed on the street, by police officers is in accordance with the agency's own internal policies, or if there are areas of concern. And that simply was not a topic that was rigorously evaluated through the debriefs that occurred during the review period. So, thanks. We looked at quite a bit of video of the dispersal orders that were given by PPB leaders during these events, which were, generally delivered over loudspeaker, and often were sometimes there were no dispersal orders given before riot control agents were used. When they were given, we often saw them or found them to be insufficient and not properly documented. So they would include some information about the fact that riot control agents were to be used, but sometimes did not include appropriate routes to exit the area before the deployment of tear gas. And they also were not documented properly and consistently within PPB's own records. We also found that PPB failed to implement key internal controls on the force used by officers. So PPB's tracking of its own less lethal inventory, its munitions, was insufficient. There were no clear and consistent records that showed which officers had deployed what volume of each kind of less lethal munition, or how quickly teams were running through their inventory of less lethal munitions, and that was a problem. PPB's force reporting and review practices during the review period were also inconsistent with its own policies. We also examined the policy framework that governed what kinds of force could be used and when certain kinds of tools and techniques would be inappropriate to use, and found several deficiencies, most of which, or maybe all of which, have now been addressed in PPB policy. But at the time, PPB policy did not address what PPB, or what has been referred to as the dynamic tactic, which is also known sometimes as a bull rush, and the baton pushes that often occurred at the conclusion of the dynamic or the bull rush. So the dynamic or the bull rush is when a line of officers runs sort of in sync and unison towards a group of individuals to try to force them to leave an area. It is a tactic that has very limited applicability in a public order environment. And to the extent that it ever would or could be used, it should be identified. The limited circumstances in which it could or should be used should be identified and clearly discussed within policy. That was not the case in 2020. PPB's threshold for the use of area impact munitions or rubber ball grenades was also too low. PPB directives authorized officers to use the FN 303 and 40 millimeter systems to avoid the use of a higher level of force. That is really a extremely vague standard that's not consistent with best practices for the use of those tools. And officers were also authorized to use OC spray when a person indicated their intent to engage in physical resistance. That is not an appropriate standard for the use of OC spray. We also looked closely at the effectiveness of PPB's public order training. And I think our top line finding here related to the process by which public order training was approved and delivered. And there simply was not sufficient oversight of the public order training program. Again, hearkening back to the level of deference we've already described that PPB Command had for the RRT as subject matter experts in public order techniques. There was too much deference for the RRT in crafting and delivering public order training without vetting it through a legal review first, or without vetting it through the training academy first. And so that led to various issues and problems, some of which have been publicly disclosed in the content of the public order training being given to police officers in the PPB. There was also insufficient guidance in RRT training about when force was authorized and prohibited. We also found that PPB did not adequately train mobile field forces officers, and that the training didn't sufficiently address de-escalation and procedural justice. Those are two extremely important concepts that are featured in other aspects of PPB training, but they have a special place in a public order training program, and they simply were not sufficiently featured within the public order training that was being delivered in the years leading up to 2020. So we made 12 recommendations to the city in this report, and I'll run through them reasonably quickly, and then we can turn it over for Q&A. First, the city must rebuild its mutual aid network. So the city has traditionally relied upon its partner agencies for support in times of emergency. It will continue to need those partner agencies. And one of the biggest problems operationally in 2020 was the fact that Portland really stood alone with very little, with some support from other regional agencies, and certainly quite a bit of support from the Oregon State Patrol, but insufficient support to meet the city's needs from other regional law enforcement agencies. And so the city really must prioritize rebuilding that network of mutual support, address the concerns that have come up from other regional agencies, enter into intergovernmental agreements with promises of reciprocal aid. Of course, Portland does not control other government entities. It does not have the power to do this on its own. It will take a concerted effort from agencies around the region and possibly state partners to get this done. But we put this recommendation first because we think it's just that important that there be a concerted effort amongst government partners to create a new, more durable mutual aid network. PPB must also dramatically reduce its reliance on crowd dispersals with riot control agents like CS, gas, and public order events. PPB must strengthen and clarify its public order and use of force directives. The city must ensure that PPB directives related to internal controls during public order events are followed. The city must create a new specialized public order team consistent with emerging standards for advanced public order units. It's our view that the current architecture for public order response in the PPB is simply not sufficient. As Pete here likes to say, public order policing is a specialization that requires a tremendous amount of iterative training and practice with a focus on de-escalation and force avoidance. And having officers who don't have that level of specialized training in one of the most active protest cities in the nation is simply insufficient from our perspective. The new public order team must be rigorously scrutinized by PPB executives. It must be overseen by Portland's new oversight agency, and it needs to be transparently introduced to the public. The public should never again be surprised by the kinds of tools and strategies and tactics that will be used for crowd management or crowd control on the streets of Portland. And we provide a number of suggestions for how to bring the public in to a collaborative relationship with respect to this new public order team. And we look forward to seeing what approach the city takes to that issue. The city must continue to improve its public order training program consistent with recent National Tactical Officers Association standards. PPB policy should require chiefs to be engaged with and visible to officers in the field during public order deployments when possible. PPB should prepare a deep bench of leaders to serve as incident commanders and operations section chiefs. PPB should develop a pre-operational briefing checklist and hold supervisors accountable for providing comprehensive briefings to officers before public order deployments. PPB also should formalize the debriefing process for public order deployments. And finally, we've been asked to return in 180 days to assess the city's progress at implementing, at integrating the feedback we've provided in this report and implementing the recommendations we've provided. And so our 12th and final recommendation is that the city should engage in its own self-reflection and produce a detailed self-assessment in 6 months reflecting the steps it took to implement these recommendations. So I'm going to put it down there, and we're happy to hear any questions that you may have.
Great. Well, thank you. We've got a bunch of questions that have been coming in through the Q&A, so we'll dive right in there. Mr. Vicente San Martin has asked 2 questions, so I'll ask them together. His first question is, how are the Portland police doing overall? And his second question is, or maybe a comment, is that Portland, and I'll just quote here, Portland gets lots of reforms on Portland police. I would like to know, is Portland police going to get any real change? I feel reforms are no good. So to the extent you can answer that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid and important question. We weren't really hired, we weren't asked to look at how the PPB is doing overall. So it's a little bit outside of our scope. We were asked to look essentially at one slice of history in 2020. So I'm not sure that I can really answer the question of how PPB is doing overall. With respect to your concern about reforms, I think there are a lot of different approaches to, the very radical approaches to criminal justice issues. There are reform-oriented approaches. We have made here a series of recommendations that, if diligently implemented, we think will make the streets of Portland safer in the event of future protest or even civil disorder. And so we're very hopeful, notwithstanding your concern about reforms, we're very hopeful that these changes are made because we want people to have a safer experience, in any kind of future protest activity in Portland.
And there are accountability mechanisms in place. The city will be preparing a self-assessment, and the team will be going back and looking at compliance or non-compliance with its recommendations. Stay tuned.
Right.
Great. So I think what I'm going to do is focus on the questions for our panel first, and if we get through those, I can circle back to some of the questions, some of the other questions that are maybe less related to this presentation. The next question in the Q&A, and I encourage everyone who has a question to drop it in the Q&A. This question is from Jake Doctor. It says PPB, I think leaders have committed to fixing being present during riots. How? And then the next question is, RRT is disbanded. Does PPB plan for future military responses to protests? This might be a question for both you and the chief, who is on. We've just had some technical difficulties, so we can hand it over to him whenever you like.
So as to the first question, Jake, my understanding is that the leadership of the PPB has committed to being visible, to showing up in the field, to not being, isolated from whatever's happening in the field in the event of future protest or civil disturbance in Portland. How that occurs operationally, how much time they'll spend in the field, I'll leave to the chief to determine, and his command team, but they have indicated that they are committed to being more present in the field than consistently happened in 2020.
As to the military response, the goal of public order response is to be the opposite of that. Modern policing is based on what we call Peelian principles, as espoused by Sir Robert Peel in the early 19th century in England, and which modern policing actually arose as a result of not wanting the military to handle problems like this. So one of the things that we try and do is have what the goal is, and some of the recommendations are to give Portland specially trained officers who can operate in that very difficult environment with an eye towards de-escalation, protecting people's rights, while at the same time addressing those pressing acts of criminality in that time, without treating the crowd as a homogeneous group and allowing them to do so in as non-threatening a way as possible. To maybe, if that makes sense.
And Chief, if you can unmute, maybe you could just add a few words about how you view this recommendation and your sort of at least preliminary plans to implement the recommendations here.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I think for me, looking back, hindsight to 2020, I think there was an opportunity to be more present out with the officers who were on the line or doing crowd control in the field. I'm not sure what that would look like necessarily. Like, it might not look like me being on a line with them there, but I feel like being more present, myself and the other chiefs, would have made people feel more supported and maybe would have given us a little bit different perspective. We tended to spend a lot of time in command posts with other decision makers, incident command, the superintendent from OSP, the sheriff from MCSO, who we're partnered with for a lot of the events. And I think that kind of isolated us from the folks in the field. And when I visited the mobile field force training we did last year, that was one of the things I talked about that I would do differently. And then as far as militarily, the military look or feel to our crowd management efforts, I do feel like it's a balance. We don't want to show up looking militarily or imposing or anything like that, but we do want to have sufficient and adequate protective gear as well. We're going to look at NTOA's recommendations. We're going to look at just different ways to outfit the folks that are out there doing the frontline work. One of the things we did do in 2020 was employ demonstration liaisons, or DLOs as we called them, and they were just in kind of a khaki pant and polo shirt look, and they did a lot of interaction with folks in the crowd, trying to give instruction, communication, get information, and share information, and that proved effective in some of the events. So that's something we might look to do more of as well.
Thank you, Chief. All right, moving to the next question. This question is from MC. You had said bull rushes have limited applicability in these types of situations. This was a tactic used on a near daily basis. Can you elaborate on what you mean by limited applicability and what situations it is useful for? And does that mean this tactic was seriously overused by PPB throughout 2020?
The tactic as described is one that does have the utility, but it's basically designed for the most violent concentrations, and it's actually designed as a tactic to allow use of force decisions to be taken from the command level and put down to the individual officer level, so that command isn't forced to make a decision to deploy non-specific force such as CS or sting ball grenades, and to allow officers to get close to a crowd and make that decision while at the same time reinforcing the idea that the crowd is supposed to move. Now, without proper training, you can lead to situations, and training and policy, you can have situations where it is putting officers on the line without that guidance and training to make decisions that may not be good in retrospect. So the idea behind it and having limited utility is so commanders need to understand exactly when it's an appropriate tactic, under what circumstances, understand that they're putting officers in a situation where they may be engaging use of force, and then holding those officers accountable for those decisions, which for the community at large should be a win when used correctly, i.e. because the commander hasn't had to rely on something that's going to affect the larger community. That's the idea behind them. But what we're talking about in the report is without training, you end up with a situation where you have a lot of evidence of improper force at the end of it.
Thank you. All right, next question is from John H. and I'm not sure if you can answer these questions. There's 3 here, but we'll ask them, and if you can't, you can't. How many complaints to IPR or internal affairs led to no discipline due to being unable to identify a specific officer?
Well, we don't have the data on that, John. We did spend time with IPR personnel and investigators during our review, and one of their most significant challenges in handling these investigations was their inability to identify particular officers. There was a dearth of video available. There was quite a bit of cell phone video, but very little other video available. There were many cases that, as we were told, were closed without any sort of definitive finding because the officer who fired a particular kind of less lethal round couldn't be identified. What the specific numbers are, we don't know.
Next question might have a similar answer, but that question also from John H. is how many arrests were found to lack evidence of unlawful conduct or lack evidence in general?
So we can't answer that question precisely. We did get data from the DA's office, and as reflected on page 22 of our report, most of the arrests that were referred for potential prosecution by PPB were not charged. As of April 2023, charges had been rejected in 85% of cases referred to the Multnomah County District Attorney during the review period. So the DA charged and prosecuted just 15% of the cases that were referred by the PPB.
And the third question from John H. asks whether you conducted any investigation into press releases or statements by Portland Police or Portland Police Union that were inaccurate or contradicted evidence. Anything you can say there?
Yeah, we did not. That was not part of the scope of our review. So we did not evaluate press statements made by or the veracity of press statements made by the city, the PPB, or the police union.
All right, next question is from Zainab Folk. Hi, Zainab. Zainab says, thank you so much for this well-prepared and transparent report. Can we get a copy of this report? And I'll just answer that. Yep, Zainab, it's on the mayor's website. It is on the city's trending topics website. And I'm also happy to email it to you directly, so I can try and drop it in an answer to this question just so that you've got it. Moving on, has the city addressed the report yet? Heidi, do you want to take that answer?
So, good evening, everyone. This is Heidi Brown. I'm off to the side of the camera, but with the city attorney's office. And the city did issue a response, as was agreed upon. Part of the settlement agreement related to the 2020 critical assessment was that not only would the IM LLC issue a phase 1 report, which is what was covered this evening, but that the city would also file a response. And so both of those are on trending topics, where that was referenced that Stephanie just referenced. And if anybody wants it directly, please let Stephanie or me know, and we'll get it emailed out to you as well. And basically, I will just say we agreed. We agree with Zainab. I agree with you. The report was very thorough, did an excellent job, and the city agreed with the recommendations.
And Zainab, I think to your other questions regarding, kind of have there been some deadlines set into for the city to implement some of these recommendations? I think Heidi has answered that this is phase 1 and that we'll be circling back with Independent Monitor LLC with updates on implementation efforts. This is all part of the DOJ settlement agreement, so that will be shared with DOJ and with the courts as well. And Zainab, if I've missed any of your question, please just drop any parts that I missed in the chat, but I think we covered it hopefully well enough.
On the issue of us making the changes that are contained in the recommendations, part of what IM LLC will do is, as Phil mentioned earlier, come back in 6 months and assess the steps the city has taken in the next 6 months to start implementing the changes recommended. And so we will be working on that over the next 6 months. And then IM LLC will be assessing the work we've done. And then 6 months after that, so 365 days from their first report, which was issued on August 9th, they will issue a second report on what steps the city has taken to comply with the recommendations and how we're doing in these efforts.
All right, next question is from Kayla Franklin. She wanted to ask if PPB's public order team will be recommended to wear body worn cameras.
That wasn't a specific recommendation of the report, but my understanding is that those cameras are going to be provided to members of the Portland Police Bureau. It's, from our perspective, not controversial and not subject to dispute that body worn cameras should be on officers who are deployed in the middle of potential civil disturbance, like we saw in 2020. So I believe that, the city could provide a more definitive answer about what the plans are, but my sense is that they will be on those officers.
Officers will be, this is Heidi again, officers will be wearing body cameras and responding, but in order to comply with state law requirements, they'll be they will turn them on if they're witnessing criminal conduct and following through on a dispersal order that's a result of criminal conduct. So in those instances, they will have them turned on, but otherwise they will be in a standby mode and not actually recording. So that when people are engaging in peaceful protests, that the government isn't recording all their actions. So that's why we have they won't be on rolling the whole time.
All right, moving on to Heather Van Wild. Her question, why do you feel a new specialized public order team will work when the last one disbanded as soon as a single member faced even the mildest form of legal criticism? It seems clear that the people who are normally most likely to join such a team only want to if they know they're safe from consequences for their actions. Do you all have an opinion about that? And maybe we could hear from the chief.
Yeah, we have an opinion about that. We're building into our recommendations that the new public order team should be subject to scrutiny from the get-go. It should be more rigorously scrutinized by the chain of command. It should be overseen by the new community oversight entity. There should be an environment of close scrutiny of that team from the first moments of its inception. So I don't really have any opinion or comment on whether officers, the mindset of officers who might want to join that team, but we believe and we're recommending that scrutiny be built into this from the very get-go.
And I will say, in terms of the need for a specialized unit, this is an extremely difficult area of law enforcement where you must balance the rights of the larger community, the rights of different groups of people engaging in First Amendment rights. At the same time, officers are challenged with often physical threats to their safety, and it's also an area where you face liability on the back end, as you've referenced, both civil and criminal. So you need officers who are sufficiently prepared for that. Law enforcement in general in the United States has not made this an area of specialty. And we end up with images from the 60s of fire hoses and dogs. And we're trying to move away from a time when law enforcement is overwhelmed, it does not know how to respond to a point where they're trained and allow the community to function while at the same time protecting people's rights to engage in mass demonstrations to do that. So that's why the need for a specialty team. It's kind of a win-win.
Great. All right, we'll move on. We've got the next question is from Ashley Schofield. Hi, Ashley. So her first question, I think there's some more later on, but we'll start with her first question. Can the mayor's office talk on how they have discussed this report internally and what the public should expect in terms of messaging from the commissioner and bureau chief to address the lack of executive leadership in the Bureau and insufficient training during the 2020 protests. I'll answer that question, Ashley. I think this report has been discussed, within the mayor's office and with PPB extensively as we considered, the information that it contained and really provided us with the ability to objectively look at some steps that we can take. And as Heidi kind of explained, those steps and implementing these recommendations will be happening in a transparent way with public reporting, with communication to the courts and the DOJ and certainly PSEP. And I think that's our goal here is to try to provide regular updates on exactly what's been being done, how the steps are being implemented, and kind of give concrete updates on that as we move forward with these recommendations. I think that goes to the second half of your question here, which is about holding the Bureau accountable and learning from the report. I think that the ability for us to do that is all about how we implement it and how we can reflect to the community that these recommendations have been implemented. All right. I will go next. Another question from Heather. Were any of the people that filed civil rights lawsuits consulted as a part of this?
Yes, I'll take that question. Yes, we talked to attorneys who represented people who were involved in litigation against the city and against the police department, and learned facts and information relating to how policing was carried out in 2020. And we contacted other organizations, some that did not get back to us in an effort to gather even more information about litigation. But civil rights litigation was absolutely part of the source of information that based our conclusions on.
Okay, Ashley has a second question here for us. This is for our panelists. Who do you think should have been the point person to coordinate the communication and use of force during the protests? Could that have been the police commissioner who made sure the executive leadership were making the right decisions with the use of force? Who should have said your use of force, or I'm sorry, your use of RCAs are not working, we need a different strategy? Who should have said that from city leadership is the full question.
Well, there's it's sort of an unusual structure in 2020, the fact that there was a police chief and the mayor served as the police commissioner. My understanding is that there was a sort of a dynamic relationship and back and forth between those two public officials about the kinds of force that were being used and whether tactics were effective and lawful or not. The mayor in 2020 did issue several directives that restricted the kinds of, particularly focused on riot control agents like tear gas. So there were some actions taken outside the PPB from city leadership to impose some restrictions on the circumstances in which tear gas could or could not be used.
All right, next question is from Byron Vaughn. Hi, Byron. The question is the PPB ready for a riot if one happened tonight after having 3 years to get things changed? And I think, Chief, I'll ask you to answer that question. There we go. Can you hear us, Chief? How about now? All right, we'll come back to that question then. I don't know if it's an appropriate question for the panel, but if you have any thoughts.
Well, we comment in the report about, and we've commented here tonight about the structure, the public order infrastructure that is being created with a very limited amount of training for many officers in the police bureau. We understand why that approach has been taken recently. We think that that's not sufficient. that, you know, if there were to be significant civil disorder in the future, that Portland needs, as we've already talked about, a more specialized, more sophisticated public order team. So if there were to be a riot, I'm sure the department would respond in the ways that it thinks are appropriate, but we think that it needs to satisfactorily protect the city and the people of the city. It needs a specialized team with the kinds of training that Pete has already talked about. And that's the commitment the city has made to us, that it is going to create that team in the future.
Chief, I'll give you one more shot. I think maybe we have you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There we go. Yep.
Okay, great. I would agree that we do need a specialized team. I think if something were to happen tonight, for instance, we would respond to it with mobile field force. We would pull officers from precincts and from other assignments to respond. We did do a training last year that was kind of a refresher training for some of our veteran officers, but a crowd control training for our newer officers, just to make sure everyone was clear on what that response would look like, what the rules are, what things have changed in the last 3 years as far as legal updates and things of that nature. But I think ultimately, when it comes to a special team, the real benefit is the training. You have a group of people who you can now put through a higher level of training to deal with crowd control issues. With the mobile field force, it's reactionary in nature, but you have, you know, officers who are primarily focused on a patrol function who come and do, you know, this particular type of work for a period of time. But it's hard to get that number and that diverse of a group through the level of training we'd like them to have in order to be able to do this work well.
Thanks, Chief. All right, question from John H. How many times was a riot declared by Portland police without meeting the criteria of a riot, which is 6 or more people engaged in violent and tumultuous behavior?
I can take a answer at that. The information we were able to collect from the department identified in activity logs, kind of after action reports, and other material didn't aggregate enough information about when riots or unlawful assemblies were declared and the reasons for them. So I don't think we have a clear answer on that. I would say that unlawful assemblies were declared more often than riots, and that when what we've been able to review, that when riots were declared, crowd behavior had escalated beyond the projectiles and some of the lower level conflict that was more common precipitate unlawful unlawful assembly declarations.
All right, next question is from Sangha. Her question is, what will happen if the recommendation's not done? Why isn't it mandatory, not just a recommendation? Heidi, do you want to speak to that, or?
Well, I mean, the city has agreed with the United States, and Judge Simon, the judge assigned to this case, has adopted our amendments that incorporate this requirement that we would get this critical assessment performed and receive recommendations. So if the Department of Justice felt that the city had failed in its obligations under that paragraph in the settlement agreement, then it would have the authority to notify us if they felt that we were in breach, and we would go through the process of determining whether or not the city was in breach of the settlement agreement.
If I could just point out that in the field of police oversight and inspectors general, that's the way change is effected through recommendations. And these IG offices don't have the authority, whether it's New York, DC, or any other city, to impose needed reforms. But that's where the importance of the community comes in, keeping the feet to the fire, making sure that the police department in the city carry through the recommendations. Recommendations can be very powerful, but without community support for those recommendations and vigilance, might lack efficacy.
All right, next question from MC. In your interviews with PPB officers, did you get any sense that part of the issue causing PPB misconduct was a culture issue among officers regarding attitudes towards protesters, including nonviolent protesters? If so, would that culture make policy reform difficult within the Bureau?
You know, that's an interesting question. We focused on gathering the facts. We had very detailed interviews with quite a number of police officers in the PPB and command personnel. We certainly heard a lot of strongly expressed opinions and frankly, a lot of, pain and frustration among police officers about their experiences in 2020. I don't think we heard or were able to diagnose from those interviews a culture that was hostile towards protest or protesters. We certainly saw, video and incidents that were concerning to us related to the conduct of police officers towards protesters, but that was not something that we diagnosed in our interviews and meetings with police officers in the city.
Thank you. It looks like there's a couple of follow-up questions to John's initial question about declaration of riots. First question, how many times was an unlawful assembly declared without meeting appropriate threshold? I don't know if you can answer that.
I think it's the same answer. There was no centralized record that documented all these declarations and the reasons for them. And what we were able to review, most were declared after there were projectiles being thrown, other activity in the crowd that created danger, which is probably consistent with their policies, the PPB policies at the time. But again, we don't have specific counts and percentages.
And I'll just follow up with the last follow-up there, which asks if you can give any examples where dispersal orders were inappropriate or unlawful.
I think what we heard most in our review were the dispersal orders that, so dispersal orders should do a few things. It should, tell people that they need to leave. It should identify the consequences of not leaving, can be placed under arrest, subject to a use of force. But then it should also describe the routes with which people can leave an area safely.
And also why they need to leave.
And why they need to leave. What we heard most often were dispersal orders that didn't have a route for how to leave safely, or times where those routes were inconsistent with the behavior of officers in the field, where people might have been directed in ways that, in directions where force was already being used, the right control agents were already being used.
All right, next question is from Debbie Iona. How do you deal with accountability when officers from other jurisdictions are asked to assist in crowd control events?
This is a great question. It comes up often in large kind of public order incidents. It can become incredibly confusing when there are uses of force. When you have multiple agencies working together, it can be very confusing to identify who has used which munition and when, which agency it came from. So that's actually a really terrific and insightful question. Generally speaking, PPB and the city of Portland have the authority only to investigate and discipline their own personnel. Every agency has sort of control of only its own personnel. So in a mutual aid sort of environment in which multiple agencies are working together, if one agency receives evidence that suggests that an officer from another entity has engaged in the use of inappropriate or excessive force, generally it would be referred by the one agency to the other for them to handle and investigate and impose any discipline if discipline is warranted. But it becomes very confusing. Pete, I don't know if you have anything else you want to say on that.
This is, I also think, a great question, and one of the reasons that the report stresses the need for mutual aid, because this happens on the front end through intergovernmental agreements and an understanding of the jurisdictions of each other's capabilities and use of force policies, training, and reporting requirements. And so, just as Nick mentioned, if you get that they have the same accountability that that the host agency has, and having been done a number of these through that, those are questions you have to ask on the front end. It's hard to figure that out when things are on fire and people are rushing around trying to get somewhere. You do it in advance, so you figure that out, and how officers are identified, how you're gonna, what situations does your policy call for use of force? Whose use of force policy you're operating under? How do you account and quantify that use of force from the visiting agency to the host agency? All that should be worked out on the front end.
So next question is from Dan Handelman. Dan says, this afternoon, the presenters told City Council that the term for crowd control is now public order. Why did they choose to use the loaded word riot in the title of the report? And a side note from Dan is that the term public order, in his opinion, sounds like something George Orwell would use as doublespeak.
Well, thanks, Dan, for the literary reference to Orwell. I can understand that perspective. We included the word riot in the title of the report for, I guess, probably one principal reason. We saw, as we reviewed, extensive amounts of video footage of what happened in Portland. What we saw was mostly protest activity. We saw people on the street marching, occupying public space, chanting, engaged in protest activity of all kinds. But there is a distinction between protest and something that goes beyond just protest. We also saw evidence of significant violence and property damage and destruction, incendiary devices being used, fires being set. It wasn't pervasive. It wasn't all the time. It wasn't everyone, but there was conduct that went beyond what we would consider to be protest activity. And so we wanted to clearly distinguish between protest and riot. And so that's why we use that term in the report.
And I can speak to the adoption of the term public order as a term of art. This is part of a national conversation, indeed international conversation. Previous monikers such as civil disturbance unit and riot squad are pejorative and capture only a small percentage of mass gatherings. In 2020 nationwide, estimates only between 3 to 5% of the innumerable mass gatherings actually resulted in violence. So public order is a term of art that incorporates not only the response to the more violent realms, which we will call crowd control, but also crowd management, and it engenders the idea being that it's the entire environment without trying to unduly influence an officer's thinking by saying you're part of the riot squad or the crowd control unit, because that should be a very small percentage of what you do. The art is keeping public order and balancing the needs of the community with the needs of those exercising their rights and making their voice heard.
All right, next question from MH. During your research, did you interview any victims of PPB's gratuitous use of force?
Yes, absolutely. People during these interviews told us about some of these incidents, uses of force that happened to them or other people they knew. So we were aware of that. We also, looked at news accounts of use of force incidents, but we talked to real people who were subjected to use of force.
Great. Another question from John H. Did Portland police engage in indiscriminate arrests and violence rather than targeted arrests?
Well, John, we comment extensively in the report on the overuse of riot control agents, which is a kind of violence, the overuse of tear gas instead of targeted arrest to identify and target just those individuals who are engaging in violent behavior. So that is something that we feature and discuss quite a bit in the report.
Looks like we have a request maybe for our panelists to reintroduce themselves. I think folks maybe missed the introductions again, but we have a request, I think, for your info, Pete.
Well, my name's Peter Davidoff. I'm a 30 plus years of law enforcement experience in the National Capital Region, involved in training and creation of public order units, liaison with an intergovernmental coordination efforts in the national capital region and also part of the larger national, international conversation on professionalizing this aspect of law enforcement.
All right, I'm gonna move down to, because we've got I'm gonna do a time check here. We've got 19 more minutes, so I'm trying to focus on questions that are related specifically to the report. Heather Van Wild asks, does the fact that 85% of police arrests were no complainted by the DA, is that indicative of the idea that police were arresting people for being annoying, not for actual criminal activity?
I don't know if we can comment on that, Heather, given there were some changing standards that the DA's office was applying to bringing criminal cases at that time, what the internal calculus was about why certain arrests were were charged or not. We spoke to the DA, we talked to several individuals in that office, but we just can't really comment on their decision-making criteria when making those decisions.
Okay. Trying to cruise through here and find the questions. Another question from Dan Handelman. The report cites the Citizen Review Committee's recommendation to the city. The chief only provided cursory responses to those recommendations, and the PPB failed to include them in his packet of information when asking for input into crowd control directive. Can the consultants address any concerns they have about the city not directly responding to CRC's proposals?
Well, Dan, I think one of the messages that we want to come across loud and clearly here is that the community has to be a part of the process of developing the standards. There has to be an engaged conversation between the community and the city and the police department about what standards should be applied to public order policing, the use of various kinds of munitions, and so on and so forth. And so the recommendations that you've cited, I think, are one important voice in that conversation that should receive attention from the city as it's crafting the new public order team. And so we will be, in 6 months, we will be following up and looking at how the city has incorporated that recommendation that we've made.
All right. I'll move on to a question from Michelle Stevenson. Michelle asks, does the Independent Monitor LLC or the City of Portland have any recommendations or desire to emotionally heal the community members harmed in the 2020 protests? There's a lot of talk about administration and business type ideas, but I didn't see a specific recommendation to validate the emotional harm, the lasting hurt and anger, and ideas to facilitate healing. And she knows she was not a protester, she's a concerned Portlander.
I would say that going back to October, when we had the town hall meeting here in Portland, that emotion came through very loud and clear. That made an impression on all four of us as we researched and wrote the report. And so the recommendations that we came up with, as I say, were informed by that passion, emotion, and angst that was caused in 2020. So it's something we took account of, uppermost in our minds. And so I would say that, yes, that was taken into effect, absolutely, into account.
Thank you. Again, just trying to make sure that we get as many questions about the report answered as we can. So I'll go now to Jay's question. The deference given to RRT seems more of a cultural issue than a training issue. And studies show training can only work as much as people are willing to accept what's being taught. I can't help but think back to the recent incidents where officers expressed bigotry towards the LGBTQ community after an equity training. Can the mayor's office and this panel speak to the need for culture change in PPB in order to have effective change? Some of this you spoke to earlier as far as culture, maybe just a recap in this context.
Yeah, this report intends to provide the kinds of technical assistance the city needs to move the department in the direction that it needs to go when there are future public order incidents, future protests in Portland. We did not do a full diagnostic on the entire culture in the PPB. We know that there was a report recently done by another group that related to cultural issues within PPB. Culture certainly is important, maybe more important in many ways than policy and training, as I think the question is suggesting. And we think that the kinds of interrelationships between the community and the Bureau that we're calling for here will work to help move the culture in the direction that it needs to go in.
Thank you. All right, I'll move to Dr. Godino's question. The city defaults to hiring contractors for much of its work, often those with some conflicts of interest or connections with city government program or political leaders. Please back up and tell us who are the Independent Monitor LLC writers of this report. Why were they more qualified for this review than others considered? How involved were community members in overseeing this review and providing input? And please disclose any conflicts of interest or perceptions of any conflicts of interest for these contractors. Heidi, can you maybe speak to that a little?
Yeah, I can at least speak to how they were selected, and then I can let Nick and his team talk about who they are. They did introduce themselves at the start, but happy to have them tell again who they are. But the city and the Department of Justice talked about folks who have the qualifications to do an assessment of this sort. Frankly, the Department of Justice, because they work nationwide, had a number of names of groups that do these kinds of assessments. And we interviewed all of them and talked to the US Department of Justice, and then landed on Nick and his team after talking to them and others. And so that was the process used to determine who would perform this assessment. And then I can let Nick answer who they are and also how much community involvement. I think Phil just talked about some of the community involvement, and throughout this evening, they've talked about all the people that they interviewed and the community involvement that occurred in that way, but I don't know if you can summarize it in one answer.
How much time do we have?
We are, time check, we have 11 minutes.
Okay. So we did provide introductions at the beginning, and I think we could just, very briefly, Pete reiterated who he is. I'm a lawyer who works with police and correctional agencies around the country on reform. I'm currently the court-appointed monitor of a Department of Justice consent decree with the County of Los Angeles and the Los Angeles County Sheriff Department.
So Matt Butis, I'm a policy analyst, data analyst, currently a policy director for Denver's oversight agency, responsible for overseeing the Denver Police and Sheriff Departments.
I'm Philip Ure. I was most recently the Independent Inspector General for the NYPD. Started up that agency, ran it for several years, and before that, started up and ran the Police Oversight Agency in Washington, D.C., and before that, attorney with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice.
I'll just add to this question. Again, this is Stephanie Howard in the mayor's office speaking. I just want to be clear and transparent that I worked previously at the Independent Monitor, the Office of the Independent Monitor in Denver, and I worked with both Matt and Nick. However, I had absolutely no involvement in their selection in this process, and they were chosen before I was hired. So just want to make sure that that is clear. All right, I'm going to keep trying to crank through questions in our last 10 minutes. So from Debbie Iona, again, the state's largest newspaper and other journalists reported excessive use of force targeted at reporters. Did you cover this in your report? And if so, please share your observations and recommendations.
We were aware of those allegations, and we looked at, as we reviewed evidence, we had that issue in our minds as something we were interested in following up on and investigating. We didn't find evidence in the voluminous evidence that we reviewed, we didn't find evidence that there was an intentional pattern of targeting of journalists. We only saw what we had available to us. We had the videos that we had the documents that we had. So we can't speak to what else may exist out there in the universe or whether anything else does exist. But based on the evidence that we had and reviewed, that was not an issue that we formed a conclusion on or an opinion on that we included in the report.
All right. All right, I'm gonna move to a question from MC. Some declarations of unlawful assemblies and riots by Portland police happened on nights where there was no violence by protesters. And the reason cited by PPB on those evenings would be that protesters were in the street and thus blocking traffic. Would this have been a valid reason to declare an unlawful assembly or riot, or was this an infringement on the First Amendment rights of protesters? Heidi, do you, or I'm not sure who would like to field that.
I believe the Oregon statute does allow for blocking of traffic for an unlawful assembly declaration.
Great. Again, just trying to work through our last 8 minutes here, and we still have lots of questions in the Q&A. Dan Handelman, I get asked today at council, there was a discussion about offering immunity to officers from other agencies who help with crowd situations. Doesn't that open up the possibility that they can do whatever they want with no consequences?
I think maybe the word that was used was indemnification from a civil liability perspective. So we certainly would not advocate for immunity for any police officer responding to protests. There's no, public purpose for any kind of offer immunity. I don't even know how that would work legally. Yeah. But I think the issue was indemnification, and in the face of a civil lawsuit, who would pay? Would Portland pay to indemnify the other jurisdiction if it were sued in a civil case?
And under Oregon tort claim law, the city is required in certain instances to defend its public employees in civil claims, and in certain instances of gross misconduct, we are prohibited from defending and indemnifying our employees. So as Nick said, two separate issues related to defending and indemnifying an individual action.
Okay, I'm going to make one quick note here in response. There's some additional questions about how to get copies of this report. The report is available on the city's trending topics website, and it is also available on, there are links to it on the mayor's news website. But again, my name's Stephanie Howard. My email is on the mayor's website. I'm happy to send them directly if anyone would like to send a request. City's response and also the city's response to the report as well is available at those same locations. So we have a question here from Pamela Fitzsimmons. Did you find evidence that Antifa tried to pass themselves off as media?
Pamela, we didn't specifically, that question was not part of the scope of our review, and we didn't investigate that question.
Okay. Justin Allen asks if police officers could be sued when they broke the law. In other words, getting rid of qualified immunity. Do you think police officers would be more careful because they feared consequences when they don't currently?
I think that's a very interesting public policy question that's worthy of debate. I know a number of states have been having debates since 2020 about the role of qualified immunity and doing away with qualified immunity. That wasn't really a part of our review, so I probably won't wade into that here tonight.
Sorry, trying to get through here in just the last waning minutes here. Okay, here's a question from John H. According to public records requests, when the federal government claimed $2.3 million in damage, a very large percentage of those costs were actually preventative measures such as boarding windows, flame retardant, paint, etc. Did you evaluate similar costs to the city?
We did not. We did not investigate the property damage numbers that we received from the city, private businesses, or any other entity.
All right. Sorry, forgive me. I'm trying just to catch up in the Q&A. So Justin also asked about whether there will be follow-up on the use of force, and I think because he didn't hear about this forum until tonight, he has a lot to say about health problems from heavy tear gas use. Heidi, could you maybe just recap the response and the next steps, the timelines that we're looking at, just so that he can understand what follow-up after this report looks like?
Yeah, definitely. So under the settlement agreement with the US Department of Justice, the city agreed that the IM LLC will come back in 6 months and assess the steps the city has taken to implement their recommendations. And they will spend the following 6 months analyzing that. And then they'll issue another report in 365 days from the first one. The first one was issued on August 9th. So next year on August 9th, we will expect a follow-on report from the Independent Monitor LLC and look forward to having that. And at that point, you will get a sense of what efforts the city has taken to implement the recommendations that you'll see in the report.
All right, I think we're down to 2 minutes. And sorry, I'm just trying to get as many questions as I can here. A question from Phil Chakla. If a judge tells PPB they can't use tear gas, what's to keep PPB from enlisting visiting agencies to use tear gas against the people of Portland and circumventing the judge's order? Does anyone want to?
I would believe it unless it would depend on the language of the order. If the judge specifically prohibited PPB and not other agencies, but in general, if a responding agency is assisting PPE, they would be de facto Portland police officers, and in my opinion, would be subject to the constraints of that order.
And on top of that, I would imagine that any plaintiff's attorney would be on alert and would want to, as part of any action to get the court to prevent the use of these agents, would include in their prohibitions on PPB and any agencies that entered into agreements. So it would be hopefully covered by them in the motion of the plaintiff's attorney.
The only exception may be federal entities operating independently may not be subject to that, depending on the scope.
And I know there were some instances in 2020 when the governor declared a state of emergency and took control of the city and sent in Oregon State Police. And they were the command and incident command in charge of the responses that night. And so Portland police were not, they're not in charge and complied with any restraining orders that were in effect against them.
All right, well, here we are, 7:30 on the dot. I know there are some questions still, so we will do our best in my office to try to document these. Sounds like we had some technical issues where folks couldn't always see the questions, so we'll work on getting that to everyone who registered. But again, you know, we just want to thank everyone who came and asked these really good questions tonight. Nick, any parting words?
No, I think I'll just highlight something that Phil said. You know, the power of this report and the recommendations really is, it's only as strong as you make it. And we certainly intend to give you as a community, we're not the experts in this community, you all are. We intend to provide you with information in a year about what has changed and what hasn't changed. And we look forward to continuing engagement with you and hopefully you follow up on these recommendations and help to make sure that they're actually carried out by the city and the PPB. So thank you very much for giving us some of your time tonight.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing from you soon.
Recording stopped.